What we talking about? Indianapolis, AFC South, Stampede Blue, let's air it out. Fly route, let's air it out. Topics, loaded like offense, Colts-centric, talk about it often. Stampede Blue, let's air it out. Fly route, let's
Welcome back to the Stampede Blue Colts cast. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Matt Danely. Thank you guys all for coming back and joining me tonight. Some of you guys have had some kind of requests to get a little more familiar with the Colts linebacking core, a couple of the draftees, and a little bit more. But we've got some news today, basically running down what the Colts have done over the past couple days or whatever. And for the most part, they've done what we expected them to do. They've cut down on some players and start to make some room for the draft picks and the undrafted guys. So the Colts, let's see, they waived Matt Jones, Justice Liggins, Arthur Miley, Joey Mbu, which I was a little surprised of. Coming back to Matt Jones, I don't know that I was real surprised about that. But Scott McLuhan has always been a guy who was real high on Matt Jones, and he was kind of suggesting that Chris Ballard was as well. I think that those two are pretty close. And it didn't necessarily surprise me. I just don't think Matt Jones really offers much to the Colts backfield right now. And so it didn't necessarily surprise me in that regard. But with considering the relationship between the two and what we have heard from McLuhan and how Ballard feels about Matt Jones, maybe that did kind of strike me as a little surprising, I suppose. But also Jermaine Grace was a linebacker, and Darnell Sankey, one of the guys that I was just saying the other day on Twitter, in fact, yesterday on Twitter, I believe that I was pretty high on, and a guy that I thought might have a real chance to maybe get, a heavy rotational job within this linebacking core. So I'm a little surprised that Sankey went off, a little hurt for that, I suppose you could say. And, we'll have to see what all that means for the future, because there's plenty of guys on here that can do it. But as we'll get into a little bit later, we'll see kind of that there are some positions that seem obvious. There are some obvious people who are going to be either starting and or, in a rotation in that role. But there's, some things left to be divvied out and figured out. So they also got rid of Jonathan Calvin as well. Nobody, just from personal, one of the guys that I liked as far as Sankey, that might be, the only, thing that made a little less sense than I would care to admit. But how that goes when you're high on somebody and then the Colts get rid of them. That's almost seems like exactly the way it should always go, right? So the Colts also made their signing of 10 undrafted free agents, official. Michael Badgley, kicker from Miami, Tomasi Lolile from BYU, Chris Cooper, defensive back from Stony Brook, Sky Moore, linebacker from South Carolina, Lashard Durr, defensive back from Mississippi State, George Odom from Central Arkansas, also a defensive back, Steve Ishmael, wide receiver from Syracuse, William Osai, San Jose State linebacker, Robert Jackson, defensive back from Nevada, Las Vegas, and Henri Tolliver, DB from Arkansas. So with all the talk of, the Colts not grabbing any defensive backs, corners in the draft, they kind of went after some guys, I guess you could say, between the two spots on defense, the defensive back and linebacker, where you think that they, possibly have some affinity for a couple of these guys, being that, they need fresh faces. It's no real different than a draft aside except for what you're talking about as far as skill level. But, these guys were targets of Ballard and company. At some point, they understood that these guys could probably miss out on being drafted. So obviously they thought that they were worth bringing in. And I think that doesn't really hurt the Colts. Because we'll look real quick at their, their, not their depth chart, but, kind of who they've got on the roster right now, that you're going to see at least being in a rotation. And whether you consider it to be a good rotation or just the rotation, obviously a lot remains to be seen from, we've got a long time between now and camp when things start really boiling down. So there could be some additions, there could be, some subtractions, obviously, between now and then. But Kenneth Acker, one of the guys that they just signed, he's in his 5th year. He and Pierre Desir are basically the same age, 26 and 27. Desir is a little taller and a little heavier, and Desir got a lot of time in last year, when obviously Vontae wasn't fitting the bill. So that Lashard Durr signed him. He's 5'10", 190. Hairston, obviously, who projects, at least per the assumption from last year, that he's going to be the nickel. And then Robert Jackson was another one of the guys that they signed. He's 6'1", 202. Chris Milton and Kenny Moore were familiar with, but they've also got, DJ White, Quincy Wilson as well. So do they have, they have a starting 3? I think on the surface, yes, you've got Desir, Wilson, and you've also got Hairston there, right? So when you look at the backups, Milton was considered a slot guy or a nickel guy. Kenny Moore played a little bit outside, which is a little strange at 5'9", but this might kind of help him get in the mix with a little more zone action out of the corners and what they're to be doing. He just as physical as he needed to be, but he is a little undersized. So that comes into play as well. We don't really know much about the undrafted guys that are there, but they've all got kind of the requisite size that he brought in. 5'10" was Durr. He's the shortest of the group that he brought in. So they've got length. You would assume that they've got some speed, or they wouldn't be DBs. So it'd be kind of nice to learn a little bit more about them as the process goes on. I think that, we're all kind of, fumbling through tape to try to figure out who's what and what kind of a player some of these guys are. And, for the most part, we're just not going to know. That's just the way it is. Not until we start hearing about some reports at camp, whether it be rookie camp, mini camp, and going on all the way through training camp. And we've got a lot of time for that. So right now, no, we didn't draft one, but you can at least look at the positive that they've got a starting 3 kind of set, at least on the surface. And they've got some guys that they like coming in. DJ White, like I said, he was a mid-season acquisition last year. They claimed him off of waivers from Kansas City. So that Ballard's got, he's got the past with him, and there's something about him that he likes. So I'm not too worried about the cornerback position, but that's not why we're here today, though. We're here to kind of talk about these linebackers, and I do kind of want to just go through a couple of them, the guys that were drafted, and talk about them real quick. I did a piece the other day on Darius Leonard, and it was also a little bit about Sky Moore as well after he was signed as as a undrafted guy. But Darius Leonard is a guy who we can talk about being overdrafted. I didn't really see it. If I'm not mistaken, when the Colts drafted him, per our big board, from our draft guide, I think that Darius Leonard was kind of the best player available that was a non-quarterback. So in fact, I don't think there was a quarterback ahead of him at that time anyways. But, that kind of, it kind of lets you know the way that we graded him as well. And I know Jake Arthur, like I said, he's really high on him. I was not familiar with him, honestly. Went back and watched as much of his tape as I could. I watched a few full games and some cut-ups, but I really was impressed with him. The dude is really fast. He's long. He does a good job getting his hands up. He's regardless of what you hear from some of the Nashville guys, honestly, I think he's a really quick processor. The guy is on the move. When the ball is snapped, it almost seems he's reading the backfield and he's reading the play. I don't understand, if you have a disagreement, that's fine. But I don't understand that is one of the knocks on him. That doesn't, to me, make sense. He's not going to be that guy that we're used to from like middle linebackers. He's not going to be that guy who's going 100 mile an hour into the line of scrimmage, trying to take out, knees and stuff like that of the running back. That's just not his style. He's more of he's a little reserved as far as that goes, but he fights off blocks well. And he's able to keep, when you're being blocked, he's able to keep his eyes on the ball, on the running back, and make a play on it. And that's something that is obvious when you look at the style of play that he has you look at his tackle total, his production total in college, and it's insane. 60 and 70 tackles. You don't get that by being, basically ignorant out there. This is a guy who definitely knows what he's doing. He's got a process. He's got, a lot of things that are going for him, especially his speed and his length, really long arms. I think he's going to work out fine. If we're going to split hairs about when he was drafted, that to me at this point, that's kind of pointless, because it just really doesn't matter. If he's picked at, 46, does that make you feel better? I mean, does it matter? If he works out, who cares where he was drafted? You could say, I suppose, that there were some other guys better left on the board. That's fine too. But Darius Leonard is literally a perfect fit in what the Colts are wanting to do in Matt Eberflus's system. So I'm fine with it. It didn't make much of a difference. Like I said, if some of you disagree on it, that's fine too. We don't all see things the same. And that's just part of, what we do here, between us as fans for the Colts. So looking at, a couple of these guys that were drafted late, there's not a lot of tape on these guys. I mean, Matthew Adams was from Houston and Zaire Franklin, Syracuse. Definitely, as far as first reaction, it's hard for me to kind of tell where, Franklin really, kind of sets up. It just, I think that he is more of a will guy as far as, how he's built. He's basically about the same weight and size as Leonard. So he's not real fast either. He's not kind of that explosive guy, at least not what I saw, the limited amount of tape. I mean, limited though, amount of tape that I saw on him. So I wasn't too awful worried about that. But Matthew Adams is like a headhunting dude, right? This guy is flying around all the time. He's got a little more tape on him, but it's still, for the most part, pretty highlightish, right? And that's not how you figure out who a guy is. But like I said, I watched a couple games on him. I think I watched the full game against Louisville. I'm trying to think about the other game that I watched. Maybe it wasn't Louisville. Maybe that was actually the one I watched on Zaire. Anyways, I watched a full game on him and a couple cut-ups. And he is, he's a bullet flying through there. He lined up a little more often, like I think out of the middle roll, and I think as well as Zaire did as well, Franklin. They both kind of lined up more of a Mike role, which is the middle inside linebacker. And so I tend to think that Matthew Adams is a little more set for like a Sam role, a strong side. He just isn't big enough for that. If he's a guy, he's a pretty stacked dude too. So you may think that he could gain some weight for that. And that, maybe that fits him a little bit better. But he is, to me, a blitz option, a really strong tackler, a guy who's really aggressive. So that kind of, what do you want from that? What does Chris Ballard and Matt Eberflus want from that? But he was an enjoyable watch. He was a lot of fun to watch. So if you haven't seen him yet, get a chance. There's a couple cut-ups on YouTube for him, and that'll be something that you guys will enjoy watching too. Because this guy is literally like a speeding bullet flying around, and he's pretty interesting to watch. So we got to look at the rest of this linebacking core, though. Now, real quickly, Cliff notes on the scheme change to the 4-3. Mike, Sam, strong side. Will is weak side. There's a bunch of other terms and monikers for those kind of linebacking options, but that's ultimately what it is. Okay. The Will is a guy who's, kind of more of a coverage option for the running back. That's kind of who he handles, it seems, the most. He can take whoever comes out of the backfield, I think first or second. It just really depends on whether it could be a tight end coming backside or it could be the running back. But he has, they still have some of the, edge setting type, expectations. And so it's not as prevalent, though, with the Sam. The Sam is a strong side. He's the guy who's more often than not going to be matched up on the tight end side of the formation. The Mike obviously is a guy who is, kind of the in-between, the guy that does it all. And he's the guy who has to be able to cover deep down in the middle of the field, at least, 10 to 15 yards, has got to be able to drop into his zones quick. get into passing lanes. He's also got to be a guy who can blitz effectively and stop the run. He's got to be effective in all those. All of them ultimately do. But you want a guy at the will who's got the at the will who can run down defenders to the opposite side of the field. And that's what we have in Darius Leonard, as far as I'm concerned. Really fast. I mean, really, really fast play speed. I thought that he looked excellent on tape. Some of the other guys that we kind of got to project for these roles kind of make it fun, because they're so similar as far as like, okay, Najee Good is kind of built for that Mike role. Okay, 244 pounds, 6 foot, and he's got experience in that role. And he's also got some Sam experience as well. I think he could probably play all three ultimately, but he's the guy who's a little more built for that role, I guess you could say. Also, you've got Antonio Morrison and Anthony Walker kind of sitting there in that 240, 245 range, whereas Jeremiah George might also be in line for that. I tend to think that Jeremiah George is going to be somewhat of like the ideal strong side backer in some of the blitz formations, just because he is a little lighter. He's 235, and that's basically what a Sam or what a will run. He's not a great coverage guy, and he's more of the aggressive type backer. So you could move him in and out at Mike and Sam, I think, a little bit. But there's some options here. Like, look, Antonio Morrison, despite his size, he, to me, is going to have to be the Sam, the strong side linebacker. He has the aggressive approach. He is, a bullet. He is quick. He is decisive. He's terrible in coverage, and that's something that the Sam typically doesn't do quite as much outside of a tight end. So you're not going to see him matched up with the running backs as much. He's going to be a guy who is kind of there to regularly maybe rush the passer, not so much in blitz. That will be the backside guy is the guy once you're blitzing and you're sending them, that's when you'll send the backside guy most of the time. And I just think that Antonio Morrison right now has to kind of win that Sam role in order for him to be viable in here, because Anthony Walker was drafted by Ballard. Anthony Walker is a guy that he had his eye on, that he liked. He's 242 and, 6'1", second year. That I think that Morrison's probably going to get one of the first cracks at Mike. And so looking at kind of the rest of the group here, right? Josh Perry is a D lineman now. He was an offensive or outside linebacker in the old system. Jabal Sheard, Simon, Terrell Basham, those guys are all defensive ends now. They're not linebackers. Okay. Looking at Sky Moore, he's going to be a will. He's a more aggressive guy, but he's only 220 pounds. He can't play the Sam. Okay. And he's not strong enough, in my opinion, or decisive enough to play the Mike. And he's not big enough. Like I said, he's under 220 pounds, but he is a really good coverage guy. Okay. And he's aggressive. He likes to be the power guy in the two, whereas Darius Leonard's a little more, like I said, a little more laid back. He's a guy who's not going to force himself into the gaps to try to blow up running backs typically. He's a good, solid tackler. He's not a killer. You know what I mean? Some of these other guys are. Like Morrison, he'd love to split a guy in half. He's just so bad in coverage and so bad fundamentally that Sam is kind of, like I said, kind of his last ditch, in my opinion, for this roster to kind of make and form a spot on this team for him. Najee Good would be, like I said, my guess to start the Mike, just because of his experience. He was brought in, from the Eagles. You can make the connection there. And he's, like I said, I think he's kind of the designed guy to take that role. I don't know much about William Osai. These undrafted guys, for the most part, I don't know a ton about them, so I can't really say. But you can kind of guess, at least by what you're seeing from them, just in their measurables. 6'1", 234. Unless the guy is stacked and is a really, really strong guy with his hands and is able to fight off, or offensive linemen, tight ends, and do all that stuff, he doesn't project necessarily to be a Sam. I think that maybe a Tyrell Adams is a similar guy. You don't know about these guys because we just haven't seen them play. And I don't know, Adams has been in the league for a few years. I just don't know much about him. That's just, that's just true. I'm not going to make a guess about somebody as far as their skill set. But, like I said, looking at his measurables, that's kind of what he projects as. Now, Adams is a little bigger, a little taller. And he might be an option for the Sam, but it's like I said, you seem like you've got Walker and Good, and even Walker and Morrison could be interchangeable as far, and let me rephrase that. Walker could be maybe interchangeable between the Sam and the Mike, whereas I think Najee Good might be the starter there. I think that you've got Antonio Morrison, a guy who could kind of work back and forth as well, depending on what package they're in. I just don't see him as being able to hold down the Mike. But depending on how bad his coverage is, like if they don't see him as even being able to hang on to tight ends and to be able to carry them into the flats or up the seam or whatever, they may just have him at Mike as a rotational guy, because they may think that the only thing he can do is drop into a hook zone or something like that, and he can't really carry anybody man to man. So it's hard to tell with Morrison. Some of these guys are difficult to figure out. I mean, there seems to be like a template for each position, right? But there's so many guys right now for the Colts that really don't fit the Mike or the Sam necessarily. And when you look at their structure of their body, what's their play style? That tells a lot too. You could be 235 and just be an outright physical guy and be able to create a ton of leverage and to be able to hold off linemen and tight ends and all that stuff, depending on your play style and your how technical you are and fundamental. But that's just not typically, the case. And we're all new to this system. Okay. Believe me, when the Colts were in the 4-3, the Tampa 2 with Dungy, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it until the Colts switched over into the 3-4, to be quite honest with you. So, I mean, learning these basic pieces of what the linebackers do is kind of a new deal for us. And not only that, but you've got to consider the guys that they've got on the roster. That's where you really are going to figure out who's there, who's able. Looking at the group that's itself, everybody knows that I like Jeremiah George. I think he's a real physical guy. He's a decent cover guy. I think he's a better coverage guy than a few others on here. But I think as far as stature, he's not a guy who could play the will, in my opinion. He's a guy that would be better designated towards a Sam because of how he plays, not because of his stature. Only 235. And I think George has some pass rush ability as well. And he's just a really tough dude. So I think that he may be in line for that Sam as well. Like I said, Morrison could be interchangeable for that because of size, because of his aggression. Anthony Walker is a guy who we're going to have to see develop, folks. I mean, he just has been a guy that kind of started, got some rotational play as a rookie, and then, got injured and just really never came back, whether that was solely injury related, or it was, that his play had just kind of fallen off. That's up to yet to be determined, I suppose. So I don't really know the answer to that, I guess, is the best way to say it. I'm interested. I'm really interested to see Good. I really am. He's one of the older guys on the roster. Like I said, he has the experience in that, played in the Super Bowl, and kind of has the ability to work that role as well. Now, he might be a little more familiar with this system, and they may have brought him in to be kind of the guy. Nobody knows what's going to happen with some of these other guys who were drafted by Grigson, Morrison in particular. But even still, you have a guy like Sky Moore. Now, like I mentioned to you guys about him, he's a guy who could possibly, and I know he's a linebacker, I'm not trying to take him out of position, but he's a guy who could kind of fill like maybe a nickel safety role at times to kind of improve maybe the coverage. And I'm wondering if he makes the roster, if that could kind of be his role. Now, Geathers is a good safety. He's a good coverage safety. Depending on how they do that, I'm just saying it might be a possibility in some packages to have him kind of in that role. Not that he would be designated for that role as a roster spot. So he's going to be interesting to watch. I'm interested to see what Osai does. I'm really, really interested to see what Matthew Adams does. Like I said, he's more of an aggressive dude. He kind of fits the Jeremiah George role. He's a couple inches taller than him, so he's not a small guy. But I still find myself interested into how he kind of would fit into this, if he makes the team. Is he really that good? If all you're seeing is highlights of him blowing people up, that doesn't do anything for us, right? That means he's a special teams guy, But if the guy can cover and the guy can play and he can read offenses and he can flow to the ball and all that, then he's going to get a job in here as a rotational guy at worst. So that is definitely interesting. This linebacking core is a lot of fun to think about, but I don't think that the Colts really have a legitimate backup at Mike. And there is Morrison, there is Good, and there is Walker. I don't think Morrison's the answer at Mike. Take him away. I don't know about Walker, right? I kind of touched on this a few seconds ago. I don't know about Walker. So if Good's the guy and Walker doesn't pan out, the Colts have a real hole there in that linebacking core. Some of these guys, you might know some of these guys better than I as far as, what they've done in college and whatnot. But, what kind of roles they've played. But Zaire, he played in more of a Mike role. He's almost 240, 6 foot. So that's a possibility. Maybe he comes in as a guy that can play the Mike. I don't think he's good enough to be the Mike, starting. I didn't see that out of his game film that I got a piece of. But at the same time, it could be, a possibility. So a lot to think about. We're going to take a quick 5-second break, guys. We're going to come back and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about these linebackers. We'll move on to some other things as well. Welcome back to the Colts Cast, guys. I needed a quick drink. Throat getting pretty dry here. So I'm anxious to see this linebacking core. I'm anxious to see them in camp. I'm anxious to see even just the rookie camp and mini camp to see kind of what Chris Ballard Chris Ballard's not a coach, but I'm anxious to see what they're planning to do as far as, Matt Eberflus, who he likes, what he's intending to do with who. And my dogs are barking like crazy. So sorry about that if you guys can hear that. But I'm excited to see how they've got them set up, who they like, who are some of the undersized guys that are going to be playing some of the more impactful positions in the linebacking core and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how that all shapes out. And not to mention, here in the next week or better, we're going to be seeing a lot of guys around the league getting cut. We're going to see a lot of guys who are maybe not even like the older guys, maybe mid to upper 20s, 26, 27. Some of those guys become available. That could be something that Chris Ballard is eyeballing right now. What is it, May 8th? That those, some of those guys could be, kicked aside. And, I'll be interested to see if he feels that bringing in yet another veteran might be the answer. That might be the answer, even though he's tried to stay away from anybody bordering 30 years old as much as he can. I don't disagree with that. I think that I don't think that you want some of the older guys, running through here and taking time away from young guys who could be starting in a clear rebuild, right? You don't want some of these old guys getting too many snaps. You want the guys that you plan to develop. Who do you see as a future starter who might not be there yet? Some of those guys just can't get on the field right away. Some of those guys, I think they need to get on the field right away, because if they don't get them on the field right, you don't know what you've got. Practice time means nothing. We've seen it time and time again at camp, where you see a guy who plays great in camp and just can't do it in the regular season. Vice versa. You see a guy who looks terrible in camp and he's a gamer. Some of those guys, they're at every position and on every team, and that's just the way it is. So how are they going to not only develop them, but how are they going to view them, and how do they see kind of what they bring, what their skill sets are, and so on and so forth. So this linebacking crew, is quite interesting. I'm anxious to really get those guys to find out who's starting where, who they've got placed in this role and that role, because that'll tell us a lot more about how they actually view this roster that they've got in front of them. If they were bringing another guy, I think that does nothing but help this team, help the development process, to be quite honest with you, because like I said, you don't want to take snaps away, but at the same time, you can't just throw somebody in there who is too raw and too unable to really fulfill the role. Outside, the linebackers outside of that, I think that you've really got a nice piece in Darius Leonard. Like I said, I was not a guy who had looked at much tape of him, but I think he's definitely a guy who can fill not only the role perfectly that they want from him as a starting will linebacker, but I think he also brings so much more just in his athletic profile, his possibilities, and his speed, and all the things that he has, his intangibles, so to speak. I think that those are going to be very, very interesting. Now, I want to look at this wide receiver group as well. I only kind of planned on doing linebackers, but this wide receiver group's really got me really interested over the past couple days. And now you guys can remember maybe a few weeks ago, we've talked about, that I thought that maybe Ballard might wait on the wide receivers until a little bit later on in the draft, because I felt like he had some size and some speed in some of those guys that are at the bottom of the roster that he might think can, help and kind of complement T.Y. Hilton and Chester Rogers. We know Chester is an endless worker. We know what T.Y. Hilton's going to bring. The Colts need not only a possession guy, but ultimately what they wanted from Moncrief, a guy who's got size and length, who can be a red zone target, who can also bring some speed to take the top off of defenses, but also a guy who can work underneath and catch some of those possession, passes to keep the chains moving. I don't know a ton about Dre's Anderson as far as like what he legitimately brings to the field. I don't know that, but KJ Brent's a guy he's been talked about a lot. He's got size, he's got speed. Ryan Grant, the Colts signed Ryan Grant. Did we all forget about that? He's 6'2", 205. And he's another guy. He's 27 years old. He's not young, but he's a guy who still has some possibilities. Now, Baltimore kind of failing his physical, that to me was something that we needed to keep our eye on. And I think we still need to keep our eye on, because we don't know what he brings. He was a solid player for the Redskins last year. I mean, we just don't know. We don't know what he's going to bring. And like I said, the failed physical really it is a red flag. And I think that, with Kamiko Toure, some of the other guys who have had some injuries in their past, I think that this, don't want to say interesting. I've said that about 100 times tonight, but it just really, it makes me wonder why Ballard is so comfortable taking guys with injury history like that. They all have a really nice ceiling and high upside, but what is the point when you've got other guys who have less of an injury history? Maybe if you're going to bring in a guy that has a great ceiling, maybe a little raw, maybe isn't a starter right away, but has, great possibilities. Why don't you bring a guy in maybe who's a little less raw, a little more polished, less of an injury history? And I like the Kamiko Toure pick. So let's, I don't want to go down that roll or that hill, but it makes me wonder why he's so confident in bringing in some of these guys who have been injured. Cause he was like pretty badly injured for, a couple years. I don't think that he really came out of that. And I think he's seeing a lot of the upside, but he's not really, maybe concerned about what the injury issues are. Darius Fountain, we've got an interview with him. Our Chris Blystone actually interviewed his wide receiver coach from Northern Illinois. Great interview. I was glad for Chris to be able to get that hit. The wide receiver coach was more than acclimated to talking about Fountain, and they really loved what he did. Now, a lot of people, he said, were calling him raw, Fountain as far as, you know, what his abilities to bring to the NFL draft and to an NFL team would be. But he seemed to think that he developed really well over the past couple of years. Is a great guy, and you know, we've seen some of the highlight tapes with him. So the guy's got a lot of what the Colts need there. Some dynamic. He's a kind of a big dude, 6'1", 210. You know, that's good size. But the Colts have some of the other guys in here. You know, 6th-round pick Deion Kane. He's 6'2", 200. You know, and we, like I said, we've talked about some of these other guys. Krishawn Hogan, 6'3", 220 with speed. He was injured last year right after coming up to the active roster. I'm interested to see and kind of intrigued to see what he can legitimately become. Not just can he make the roster, but I think that he's got, and I won't say superstar power, that's not what I'm saying, but I definitely think that he's got some ability to excel and become a real threat because of that. Like I said, I think a lot of these guys are who they ultimately wanted to get the production out of with the Dante Moncrief role, not necessarily from Moncrief, but they've got the 6'3" guys. Steve Ishmael, another guy that they signed as a wide 6'2", 212. That's good height, man. 6'3", 200 for Shantavis Jones. 600, 183 was Colby Listonby, a guy at TCU that a lot of people were fairly high on coming out of the draft. He did not, you know, kind of hang on or anything like that. And if I'm not mistaken, he might have gone undrafted. I'm really not sure, but he hasn't really had an opportunity to reach his peak either. Obviously, we know what Chester Rogers is going to bring, but DeAndre Smelter and James Wright, those guys are both over 6 foot. Smelter 6'2", 227. That's a big dude, right? James Wright 6 foot 200. So this wide receiver core, if you just consider that Daurice Fountain and Deion Kane could possibly work themselves into the top 4 receivers on the depth chart, then what do you get out of Hogan? Then what do you maybe get out of Brent? You know, does Ryan Grant actually come in? Does he make the team even? You know, I mean, does he end up being one of those guys that is a bit underrated and can go on and actually play and be good, be a solid pickup for the Colts? You know, I don't know that. I know that he's got the ability to, but I don't know necessarily where he's at. So this wide receiver core is really fun to look at. Thinking about Eric Swoop, Eric Ebron as well. I mean, both of them kind of extra receivers as well. I don't think that this wide receiver core, this receiving group, is too bad. I mean, I just really don't. I think that they've got some real potential. And then when you add in the fact that Nyheim Hines can catch the ball as well as anybody out of the backfield or lined up in the slot on either side, you know, anywhere, they can put him anywhere. You've also got the potential for Marlon Mack to be a really good receiving back. Some of his passes, you know, some of the passes he got were hot. Some of them were loopties over his head. There wasn't much he could do about, but he did have some issues catching the ball. He doesn't have issues, however, of making something happen when he gets into space and he gets the pass. So if he can haul it in, he's a huge threat. But this running back core, the tight ends, and the wide receivers, I just don't. I mean, I see that there's no major big time names other than Hilton. Even Chester Rogers, I don't know that people really give him, you know, have given him much of credit of anything outside of Indianapolis. But one of these guys could be a household name before we know it. Now, if Kane or Fountain end up developing into something serious, then I think that we've really got something, you know, on our hands here. I think it could be really fun and really interesting. And you'll see that the wide receiver is just not a position that necessarily is going to win games for the Colts. I mean, those big plays that T.Y. gets downfield, those make huge impacts, and they have won games. But how many, right? I think we hear other people talk about this as well. The wide receiver position is important because the game is such a passing league right now. But that also makes the tight ends and the running backs equally important. And it's all kind of a system there to get the ball out. And with Frank Reich bringing in his new system, I love the diversity in the backfield. I really like the possibility and the potential out of some of these guys that the rest of the NFL and the rest of NFL fans don't know anything about. I think Kane, with his off the field stuff, that'll be something to kind of monitor. But I really believe that Dory's Fountain could be one of those guys that just kind of comes in and takes over. He from everything that his coach said, he's an endless and tireless worker, really good dude, and has continually stepped up his play as he's progressed each year. So, excuse me, sorry, but the the rest of these guys on here, they just look to be too fun. There's too much, too many of the features that you want in a really quality wide receiver group. And think back. Peyton Manning made a lot of guys, not just young guys that nobody really knew anything. I mean, the Colts drafted Anthony Gonzalez, and even though Gonzalez couldn't stay healthy and really wasn't that good, when he did get play, he got, he made some plays because Peyton put it on his face and he had to catch the ball. That could be said for a lot of guys. Even Stokely came in. Stokely was good. Don't get me wrong. Stokely was on the back end of his career, and Peyton, what they kept him around for a few years, and Peyton just loved him. I think that Andrew Luck in this new system can be that guy who makes nobody's at the receiver position a quality weapon. And when you have speed and you've got length, some of those 50-50 balls, some of those deep passes, to TY or some of the longer developing routes, those guys opposite TY aren't going to be, overly matched. They're not going to be doubled. TY may not be doubled quite as much. So the diversity in the route trees and the diversity in the wide receiver group being able to really run all of these systems and formations is pivotal for the Colts' success, I think. I'd like to see some of these guys, kind of break the bank as far as a group. I don't want to see TY necessarily with 1,000 yards and, his annual 6 touchdowns. I want to see several guys with 5-6 touchdowns, and I want to see several guys with 600 yards, 700 yards receiving. That would tell you right there that the ball's being spaced around very well, not only because of the offense, but because of Andrew Luck. And I think Andrew Luck is, like I said, I've told you guys this before, I'm done qualifying it. Andrew Luck is going to be healthy. We've seen what he looks like. He's going to be starting for the Colts in 2018. And the Colts are going to find their way through the year. Now, we also talked about the rest of the division getting better. They were better last year. All three of those teams were better than the Colts. And now we're going to see how the Colts can react to getting a little bit of talent on their own end and the rest of the division getting more talent. The Colts really have to just stay afloat. Okay. And I mean, we're talking long term. Now, a lot of people, you don't want to be in the middle of the draft. Nobody likes, there's an excuse for everything. But if you're sitting in the middle of the draft, 15 to 16 next year, the Colts probably had a pretty good season if you actually look at what they did. When you're looking at win-loss total solely as how did the team play, you're not gonna get that satisfaction because that team, I just don't know. I mean, even with Andrew Luck, is he capable of winning double-digit games for the Colts? Yes. Against a lot of good teams. Yes, he absolutely is. We know this. I mean, we've seen it 3 years. When he was a rookie and in the next 2 years, and that in those rosters were god awful. So can the system help push Luck along? Because that's the thing. He's coming back. He's been off for a long time. He's not going to have that same pep in his step type. He's just not. It's just not going to be there quite yet, I don't think. I think we're going to see maybe a month and a half, 5-6 games where we actually have to see Andrew Luck develop himself, right? He's going to take all the coaching he's going to get from the coaching staff. Sirianni is going to be his offensive coordinator, and Frank Reich's going to be in his ear the whole time. So those guys are going to kind of have to treat Andrew Luck now. They're going to have to kind of treat him like a rookie. I don't want to parse words here, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. They're going to have to kind of inch him along, not just because he's going to be so late to the party for throwing, according to what they're saying, But because they have to get him not only square with the offense, but they've got to get everybody else square with the offense as well. They're going to have to make sure that Luck can get those balls out on time quickly and actually get them into guys in space to where they can make something happen after the catch. Andrew Luck, I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised if we see a lot of what the Colts do, not really put a whole lot on Andrew Luck. People are, I wouldn't doubt it a bit if next year, the offseason, everybody's saying everything he threw was along the line of scrimmage or everything was inside of 10 yards. That's not going to be the case. We know that Andrew Luck's going to throw it out, air it out, like the song, occasionally. And that's just what he does. But he loves to be the competitive guy. He's naturally built to get the most out of every play. Is he going to be able to do that? I don't know, but he's definitely going to have the opportunity to take some of the gimmies. That's where Andrew Luck can kind of succeed or fail at an earlier pace next year. I think, like I said, we don't know what the early half of the schedule is going to bring as far as who plays well and who doesn't, who's healthy, who's not, who's actually on the team at that point. Even, this roster could not even look a whole lot like it looks right now. By week 1, we could have some surprise cuts. We could have, a couple of these drafted guys not even be on the team. We could have an undrafted guy who's going to be in a starting role. And we could have 2, maybe 3 or 4 even guys who are cast-offs from other teams in this on this roster. So we don't really know what we're going to see yet. But we have to be patient with Andrew Luck. We got to be patient in what we expect from him. But the ultimate like kind of X factor is going to be what kind of chemistry do he and some of these no-name receivers that the Colts have throughout the offseason, throughout the training period, throughout camps. I think that we should all be excited for what's coming, to be quite honest with you. It seems like a year to be excited, but in order for it to be exciting, you have to have a realistic expectation for what the Colts can achieve. And I like the linebacking core. I just don't think they have a lot of clarity with it right now. And some of the guys, I love the wide receiving core. They're just no names though. These are guys that I've liked for a while, and even liked Krishan Hogan coming out of the draft. So of course, I stick on that stuff. That's just what we do. We like a guy, you talk about him, they stay on the team, and you feel kind of vindicated. That's not necessarily what I'm shooting for, but you get the idea. As far as the running back, I wasn't even a Nyheim Hines guy. I hadn't really watched a ton of him either. So he wasn't one of the guys I was kind of into, I guess you could say, for the draft from the running back position. But he's tough. He's tough, guys. If you haven't seen him, go check him out. There's, like I said, there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube for him as well. He's an interesting running back, man. He's not scared. He likes to run between the tackles. He takes what's given to him. If that means going between the tackles, he does it. If that means kicking it out, he does it. If it means that he's chopping legs out of linebackers, out from underneath linebackers, he's doing that too. He's a tough kid, man. I'm excited to see what he can bring. But that leaves some uncertainty for guys, like Christine Michael and Josh Ferguson, which is fine by me, because I don't think that they've necessarily got a role with a healthy Robert Turbin and the rest of the running backs on the list being, healthy and developing. As far as Marlon Mack goes, he can develop. He had a rough season last year. I think he had some exciting plays without a question, but there's a lot of development there that still needs to take place with that running back group. So linebacking group, like I said, just need more clarity on it, and we'll get that in the coming weeks. And that's not going to stop being a fun position to think about. But like I said, I think they've got several guys who can play the will. I think they've only got a select few who can legitimately play the Sam. And as far as going back into the Mike role, I think that you've got just the 2 guys that I think Najee Goode's coming in, the experienced guy. He's going to be the guy that ultimately gets first crack. But Anthony Walker, if Ballard feels good about him at all, if Matt Eberflus feels good about him at all, they're going to give him a crack at that role. That's why they drafted him, and maybe one of those guys, whether it be Morrison or even Walker, if he doesn't, shine out for the Mike role, maybe they like him at Sam as well, just for, stature reasons. So, guys, that's about all I've got for you tonight. A little bit of rambling, but that's kind of what we do here, right? Just kind of shoot off the top of the head. Hadn't had a podcast in a couple of days since the draft recap. And so wanted to get back on here and chat with you guys a little bit. But make sure that you guys are going to iTunes and giving us a rating and review for the podcast. Those have always been very helpful. And I really want to say thank you to everybody who sends the kind words for anything, whether it be to just other guys in the staff or myself for the show or for article, just whatever. We appreciate that you guys take the time to listen or read or whatever. There's too much infighting with a lot of other small time markets and stuff like that. That's not what we're about. We really want to incorporate anybody and everybody. We like talking to other guys. I like talking to, some guys from 1070 or talking to other guys that are at other Colts sites. I mean, that's kind of what we do. We like to get an all-encompassing view of what's going on with Colts fans and other guys who are covering the team. So I thought it was really cool that Chris Ballard went and took Holder and, Kevin Bowen and whoever else he took in there to the film room. I think that's really cool of our GM. I think that's something that's really underrated for what these guys are doing. I mean, he's ultimately making the guys who are covering the team from a local standpoint far more intellectual about what's actually going on. And it's not that he's giving them any inside scoops. It's that he's trying to help them understand what this team is being built on. Legit, like for real. This is what is going on here, and this is what we want you guys to know, because when we talk about this, when you talk about it with your readers or just whatever, then they're getting the good information, right? So I think that was really cool of Chris Ballard to do, and I think that that's kind of his thing. He'd rather go with the local guys anyways than some of the national guys. We've been talking about that for a while in our instant messenger clients. So that's something that is neat, and I don't think that it's all that common among NFL teams. So I think that's cool. I also like that he lets his scouts talk after the draft. That's really cool. And he did the same thing last year with Grigson's guys that were still on board. So I think we've got a good GM. I think that patience is necessary, guys, because if we don't have it, we're going to get ourselves out of control here in the next year. We're all going to be off the train, throwing things and being upset. But I'm one of the most impatient people that you'll ever meet. I mean, as far as what I want from this team and expectations for different players and so on and so forth. But while we're all good right now, right? Nothing's happened. No games, no crappy games, no terrible coaches, terrible coach games to talk about right now. So until we get there, I'm patient. So I'm going to tell you guys to be patient. So then when I'm going off the rails, you guys can just, hey, ease up, Papa, bring it back a couple notches. So always appreciate you guys for that. Some of you helped me through some of the free agency deal when there were some clear guys that I wanted. And I always love you guys for that. That's great stuff. And I have to chill sometimes because it just gets to where you want this team to succeed so bad. I mean, we're all fans, right? And you just feel like there's some opportunities being left, and so that's how it goes. But thank you guys all for listening. Honestly, appreciate all of you. You guys are great. Thank you guys for showing up to these shows on YouTube as much as you have. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do it. SB Colts Cast. If you guys like it, we're going to start putting up as much some of the film stuff that we've been trying to do. Anything that we put on the site, we're going to put on here. And hopefully we can get some of the guys to kind of talk you guys through what they're seeing and such. And as you've seen, we've getting a little diverse with the YouTube channel and trying to get more of the staff on here. That's always fun. It's nice to see all the guys on here, whether it's Jake doing his Q&As or Brett and the guys, doing some of their side stuff. That's what it's all about, is getting you guys as much content as possible. And I know that you guys enjoy it, and just know that we enjoy doing it. So thank you guys all for listening. We'll talk to you next time right here on the Colts Cast.